So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making the time today to come. And we're hoping we're going to give you quick tips on interviewing to make sure that you feel confident and that when you're facing any upcoming or future interviews that we've demonstrated for you the strategy that's involved in interviewing, but not just interviewing, really interviewing effectively for the job that you want. So for those of you who don't know us, my name is Roshni and I run the Futures PhD and postdoc career office and the Hop to the Future event. And today I'm actually very happily joined by my colleague, my new colleague. It's her second week here, Dr. Christine Kelly, who's the Associate Director of Futures, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you very much, Roshni. Just as Roshni had said, this is my second week here at Hopkins. I'm someone who's very passionate about professional development for graduate students, doctoral students, and postdocs particularly. So really glad to be here and to have this conversation with you all today.
Yay, thank you, Christine. So today, what Christine and I are going to do is we will aim to have about 40 minutes together with you all so we can answer, spend the remaining time, 15 minutes sort of answering any questions that you have. And also the goal for today will be to share some quick, no fluff, practical strategies to help prepare for the interview. And I'm not just thinking short term with Hop to the Future next week, but I am thinking about a long-term preparation for interviews in general. So some of the techniques and tips that we are presenting today are going to be, things that you can use further down the line as well. I'm going to go back to my screen share. What are you seeing, Christine? Are you seeing my big screen?
Yes, it's on the hello slide, the welcome.
Okay, moving forward. Right. So I wanted to make sure that, I wanted to assure you that if you get an interview through this event next week, or you have any upcoming event that's coming up and in your own job search, I wanted to ask and assure you that you're going to feel a whole lot of feelings, and they include nervousness and include sort of just this excitement and just you feel underprepared, you may feel overprepared. And I can tell you that it feels sort of like this and all of this at the same time. In fact, when I received sort of the final interview round for the Futures job, I sent a text to my friend, really freaking out about the agenda and then really feeling like they had to assure me that it was completely normal. So I just want to make you feel assured that this task of interviewing in such a short period of time may feel insurmountable and may feel like this huge thing. But there is, like, if we take it step by step in preparing, it's completely normal to feel these things, but also work through these things and sort of present your best answers during the interview. So let's break it down step by step, okay? I want to first go over what the different types of interviews you can expect in general when it comes to interviews in general, in the long term, beyond Hop to the Future. And then we'll focus on a little bit about Hop to the Future. So when it comes to formats and types of interviews, it really depends on the industry, the company culture, the job role. So you can have a traditional interview, which is basically where an interviewer may ask open questions from your resume, like walk me through your resume, tell me about that time that you did this. And this interview may be one-on-one or maybe in a group. A Hop to the Future, you're going to have one-on-one chats, 15 minutes with whoever the representative is, that could then progress into a group chat or other sorts of presentation formats in the future. You also have sort of your case interviewing for consulting. This is typically done, again, like in the consulting field. Although if you applied for Booz Allen Hamilton, my experience interviewing with them is that they didn't have any case interviews. But typically, you can expect case interviews from most consulting firms, where you're given a problem to solve and you're asked to sort of walk through your thought process when it comes to that problem. Then you can have, as a component of any interview, a behavioral style interview. And this is basically them asking questions to candidates with the notion that your past experiences or past behavior can predict any future outcomes. So this portion where you may have heard of these questions, like tell me about yourself, or walk me through the time that you failed, or the quintessential terrible question of what are your greatest strengths or what are your weaknesses. This portion requires a bit of diving into situations from our past and figuring out which scenarios to present in which way during the interview. So that requires a little bit of pre-work. So in the case of this upcoming sort of 15-minute short screening interviews that you're going to have at the Hop to the Future event, it really depends on the interviewer. We're not quite sure how that conversation can go. It could be behavioral style, it could be technical, it could be a casual conversation. If you've come to my previous sessions on how to network with employers during this event, I've covered that a little bit. There's no real way to know exactly how to prepare for it, but I would be prepared for all scenarios. And the conversation here as well is very accelerated. In the next slide, I'll talk to you about a typical interview timeline. But in this situation, there's a little bit of an accelerated timeline where you have to make this big impression in a short period of time. So to keep in mind that there are different styles, and the best strategy is sort of, if you are not going to consulting and you're doing everything else, sort of to prepare for a combination of a traditional, a little bit of technical, and a little bit of behavioral style questions. We are going to add like a mock interview session this week, and we'll email you about that in case you want to practice any of these questions. So typically, you can expect to have in any of your outside interviews, first a phone screen from any company. And the entire interview process can last anywhere between 3 to 4 weeks. We know that for government positions, it can be way longer. The timeline can be very extended. And depending on how fast HR can move, this whole process can be really fast. It can be really slow as well. We had someone in this cohort of Hop to the Future attendees who got an FDA job within just a matter of 3 weeks, which is incredibly fast. It's a federal job. No one's even heard of that. So first, you may have a phone screen with a recruiter who just wants to sift out a few candidates. Then you may be invited to a 30-minute Zoom chat with maybe the hiring manager. After that, in my case, I had like 6-7 rounds. That's been the longest rounds of interviews I've ever had. I had a pre-interview where the hiring manager or boss wanted to have a conversation to prepare me for the in-person interview. And then you could have an in-person interview, which could be divided up into group and individual chats with the team. I also had, and I'm including it here, a lunch interview, which basically they said, show up to this lunch. And I had no idea what to expect because it didn't say it was an interview, but I treated it as such. And it really ended up being just another interview. And then you would typically have like a reference check. For context, with the Hop to the Future event last year, those folks who were very interesting in those 15-minute chats, last time it was 10-minute chats, this time it's 15 minutes. Those two folks that stood out got invited by the companies to then continue on along this timeline with the in-person interview, the Zoom interview, so on and so forth. So any or all of these scenarios are possible as an outcome of this event, but typically when you go for interviews, you can expect to have this sort of timeline. Okay. So first thing that you should know is you should take it step by step. And the first thing that I would do is really breathe and to gather all my information and details. What do I know and what do I have information on? There are other things that I really want you to know, and I'm going to mention that in a second. But first of all, for the October 30th and September 1st event, block time off your calendar. If you have an event coming up as well in the future, like, block time of your calendar, take your time off, take a day off or whatnot so that you have that mental space. The reason why I'm mentioning this is recently my husband was trying to do an interview that was at 9 in the morning and go to work for a meeting at 10 o'clock. It made no sense. And it was hectic and it was frantic. So if you are doing an interview, if you are able to take half a day to prepare for that time that you are going for that interview, then block time off your calendar. If you are doing an interview virtually, which many of the interviews have been for the last 2 years, is to do a quick check of all the tech that you will need for the interview. Webcam, if they are using WebEx and you've only used Microsoft Teams in the past, or you're used to Zoom and they're using some other platform, to download those platforms and to get it all checked. When I was doing my virtual interview for this position, I also checked what was behind me, like what was literally what they could see behind me. And even that was a little bit strategic, where I had a poster of like one of my I was inviting a speaker at my old job from Hopkins, and that poster was strategically right behind me in the interview call. But I approach it like you would do a literature search as a researcher. Gather all the information and details that you can possibly get about the role. You can ask us who's coming to the event. I think I want to provide with to you all in that little sheet the titles of the people who are deciding to come. We'll know all that information next week. But what is your timeline like? How many days do you have before the first interview, between the steps of the interview? Who will you be chatting? Gather all that information. I want you to remember, because this is going to happen at some point, that this before the self-doubt sort of takes over. Remember that if you are called for an interview, it's because they think you're qualified for it. So use that opportunity that you get face-to-face time with these folks to tell your professional story. Another thing that I want you to sort of take away with is that the interview is a two-way process. You're not sitting in a hot seat, and it shouldn't go like where you are sitting in a hot seat and getting grilled. It should be a two-way process where you have the opportunity and they provide you with the opportunity to ask questions about the company, the role, its values and motivations, etc. So you have clarity on if this is the company that you want to work for. It is your chance to interview them back and to figure out if this is a postdoc that you want to do, or if this is a job or an internship that you really will be happy doing. And I can attest to this 100%, where you go for an interview and you get um, terrible responses. The interviewer is cold, and it's a major red flag for whatever that company is. I had that experience when I was interviewing for postdocs at the NCI, and I knew like 2 hours into the interview, I did not want that postdoc. So ask the questions and see what people are responding when it comes to your questions as well. It's a two-way street. Again, you don't want to feel like you're sitting in the hot seat. Most good interviews are conversations. If you leave the Hop to the Future event, or if you leave a future interview feeling great about the conversation you had with the hiring manager or the recruiter, then that's a good sign. Okay. During a virtual interview, people are assessing sort of your verbal and non-verbal cues. So right now, I'm staring right into the camera. You want to be able to make sort of ideally eye contact with the person, even if you have notes on your computer or on your desk. You don't want to be constantly referring down to your notes in that setting. So just preparation. You can have post-its all along your background to glance at now and then. But for the most part, if you're able to keep and maintain eye contact, that would be awesome as well. So I never liked the idea of fit. Many companies would say that candidate is not a good fit. I don't think fit is inclusive enough. But at the end of the day, in that moment that they're interviewing the candidate, that candidate might come across as a better sort of fit than another candidate who's equally qualified. Okay. The moment that you are conversing with the employer, you may be the absolute perfect person for that role, but if you're unable to communicate at that moment your skills, values, and how you might be as a colleague, what you bring to the table, that's where sort of interviews go wrong. That communication factor is so important, and practicing for that moment becomes all the more important as well. So let's break it down a little bit more. Dramatic yellow highlights that I'm too late in hitting my next button. So across the board, no matter what discipline, what industry, academic or non-academic, interviewers are trying to establish the same couple of things. And Christine and I, we have such a immediate cool relationship. I'm giving the talk from a perspective of having recently hired Christine, and Christine's giving the talk from the perspective of having just been through an interview herself and came out spectacularly on the top out of like 60 applicants in total. So I can attest to this, that at the end of the day, people are looking for people who can do the job. People are saying if you can be a good colleague, and people are trying to basically make sure that you're easy to work with, you're a good colleague, you can handle conflict and difficulties across the board. So what they're looking for is quite often reflected in the job description, right? We've talked about this before. As you're preparing your resume, your cover letter, and preparing for interviewing, it's in the job description. The clues are in the job description. Can you do the job? Writing, research papers, teaching, troubleshooting, problem solving, they list these qualities in the job description. Will you be a good colleague is indicated when they say in the job description, looking for someone collaborative, who's mentored others, collegial, committed to diversity, and so on. And thirdly, what's your personality like when they're trying to assess that? In the job description, it'll say someone who's enthusiastic, who values growth and learning, who's strategic and open to feedback. So overarchingly, that's what the employer is looking for. Now, if you go to some of the fancy like tech companies, you may have some creative forms of, they may have some creative and out of the box forms of testing a candidate's like skills, strengths, and motivations. But for the most part, other people follow like a basic interview schedule and scheme. Okay. So I'm coming close to talking about it from an employer's perspective. What are they looking for? And then Christine's going to come in and talk to you about how to prepare for what they're looking for. So generally, when interviews don't go so well, there are two sort of broad scenarios. One is the interviewer is terrible. And from last year's Hop to the Future, there are some people who are terrible interviewers, and it's not your fault at all. And a second sort of possibility is that we aren't prepared enough. And that comes across. Suppose you're going to flagship pioneering and you're talking about resilience because you're confused about the two companies, that lack of preparation is going to come across. Sometimes it's that we don't communicate effectively when we're given 15 minutes and the job is asking us, the employer is asking us to talk about our skill sets, but we spend all that time communicating about everything but our skill sets. Then there is a mismatch, and the two trains are sort of going to pass each other in that moment. So those are typically why some interviews don't go so well. So we're going to talk about how to effectively articulate your story during an interview. And I like this quote, right? Preparation doesn't assure victory, it just assures confidence. That's so true of everything. Just like you have done your PhD defense or will do your defense or your comprehensive or oral exams, it's the same thing. There's no way to predict the outcome of how people might respond to your presentation and your thought process and how you answer the questions. But you're going to feel so much more confident when you simply feel like you've prepared enough and you're ready to go. So what does preparing entail? It's going to go back. It's about putting the pieces together. And what should we keep in mind first? Before you prepare, keep these thoughts in mind. When you're given 15 minutes and your opportunity is to basically put forth your elevator pitch and introduce yourself in those 15 minutes and speak to your skills, don't present your entire PhD thesis and life story. If you're talking to and you go to the chat, you'll see the person's title and role stated, and that person says that they are the principal scientist of Booz Allen Hamilton of AI healthcare. You can be a little bit more technical in your responses. If the title says, I'm a recruiter, and you're talking to a recruiter, and you talk all about the nitty-gritty details of data science, Python, Java, whatnot, so on and so forth, they're not going to get it. So you want to adjust your narrative depending on who you talk, but overarchingly, you don't want to produce and talk all about the nitty-gritty details of your research for the entirety of the 15 minutes. Okay. Hark back to the idea that they want to see those three things. Can you do the job that they are listing? Will you be a good colleague? And do you have that personality and growth mindset that will help you do a good job and be a good colleague? They are not looking for a perfect candidate because a perfect candidate doesn't exist. Typically, what an employer is looking for is someone who is very self-aware, who is able to understand what strengths they bring to the table, and then work to improve upon any sort of areas that they are lacking or lagging behind. Okay. When you're preparing for this event and beyond, prepare by keeping your employer in mind. Who are they looking to hire? What are they looking to see? And then sort of craft your preparation. Your narrative, whatever question they ask, is going to be crafted and tailored to the position and the company that you're interviewing for. So start again. Some of you have come to my talks since the beginning. You'll hear me say this 900 times. Start with the job description. As an employer, nothing is more like music to an employer's ears than the candidate who has done their pre-work, their research on the job description, where they've understood who it is that they're looking to hire. So for example, if there are 12 Hopkins PhDs vying for the same position, as an employer, I'm able to half that number and really progress the six forward who have prepared for the position and have come to sort of slay. So if I were an employer, I would like for the employees to start with the job description and the values of the company. Once you have complete clarity about what qualities according to them, not according to you, are important, then you can move forward. Research, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are researchers. This is what we do. This is what we're good at. Doesn't matter what discipline. Figure out which company you're applying for. What is their mission statement on their website? Who are the people that you're going to be speaking with? Who is the team that you're going to be talking to? They usually provide you with an agenda for like a further step interview. In that agenda, you saw that little text message of mine. It was a detailed agenda of who I was going to meet. Go ahead and research the entire team. What are some of their initiatives? What are some of their gaps in their initiatives? So you can ask pointed questions. You can even research who recently held the position and how long. For example, if you see that that position is being filled every few months and people keep leaving, maybe that's a red flag. Maybe that's something that you can ask. So research everything. Okay. You can even look at the salary range on LinkedIn, Glassdoor, Indeed, just in case they throw in a question about what are your salary expectations. So this is a picture of my notes for my interviews in the past. They were stacked like yay high. I don't know if you can see it, but they were stacked where I'd researched every term that I didn't understand in the job description. And I'll confess, I didn't know what stakeholders meant when I applied for a job that relied on a meeting with stakeholders. So if there's any terms that you don't understand in the job description, as we do in research, like make a separate sheet and understand who their stakeholders are, what does stakeholder even mean, even if you have to start from scratch. But do your research, and research could look something like this. But research could also be on researching ourselves. What is it that we are good at? What is it in the past? Some of the scenarios that we found ourselves in and the lessons that we've learned. And this will directly relate to the behavioral style interview questions that employers love to ask, right? If in the moment they ask you about, tell me about the time you failed, it's so hard to come up with a perfect scenario in a short period of time in the moment, right? To think about all those, the times that we failed, which instance should we be picking? Only in preparing in advance, may we, try to understand which instance we might pick. So I usually approach it this way. I had a notebook, I have a notebook, and I write down sort of my strengths, my ideas. I was like, okay, I'm good at executing, I'm good at being creative, I'm good at problem solving. And then I pick a quality that the job description is asking for. Let's say, for example, they want someone who's visionary. And then I write 3 ideas about the time that I've been have presented a visionary idea in the past. Visionary is a stupid word. Let me go for another word. Let me say outcome driven. A lot of these jobs are outcome driven. And in my previous interviews, if it's outcome driven, which I tend to be, then I created 3 scenarios in my past where I was outcome driven. And I can go all the way back to undergrad. It doesn't matter. At that time, when I had a large data set and the data set I had to analyze using the software, I was the first person who used that software to analyze that particular piece of data. And as a result, that data informed my next steps in my experiment. I know there's it's one is an experiment and one is a non-academic job, but I was data driven and outcome driven in that instance. So you want to translate your skills from your past. The only way for me to quickly come up with that is if I've sat down and reflected on these different instances in my life. So come up with 3 instances. I always draw parallels between having like a quiver full of arrows. And at that moment, you want to pull out sort of the quiver, the arrow that's the most appropriate for that question that they're asking. Okay. So last thing I'll say is that you will not have the answers to all the questions. You will sometimes be thrown for a loop because you haven't prepared. You didn't expect that question. It's completely okay. Happens to all of us. What we can do is to say, I'm not quite sure what the answer to that question is, but I'm happy to come back and get back to you. I did that in my thank you email, my follow-up. I kind of answered that question for them. So you're not expected to know the answers to everything, but you should feel comfortable enough to admit when you don't know anything. So hopefully now the pieces are sort of coming together, at least from the employer's perspective. And I'll give the floor to Christine to now showcase how she would prepare from an interviewee's position and present you with practical tips in that regard. Christine, over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Roshni. Well, in our kind of second piece of our presentation here, exactly as Roshni was indicating, I'm going to walk you through the perspective of an interviewer, a prospective candidate, and build on some of the strategies and tips you received already to think about ways that you can effectively communicate something that's so important in the interview process, which is alignment. Let me just go to the next slide here. Okay, perfect. So when you're developing a strategy as an interviewee at a prospective role, not to lean too heavily into what I agree is a kind of problematic language around fitness for a particular role, but you really want to understand the role that you're applying for as much as you can based on the materials that are available to you, and to critically reflect on your experiences, values, strengths, and priorities, and make the effective case, and to do it with a great deal of substance and vis-a-vis specific examples to show how what you bring to the table is going to be well aligned with the needs of the position and what your prospective employer is looking for in a candidate. So let's take a moment and pause once more on why possible interviews that you may go on, that many of us have gone on in the past, might not go so well. And just to build a little bit on what Roshni was saying earlier, sometimes interviews don't go so well for reasons that are kind of within our control as candidates, right? So what you might find is that you simply didn't prepare to the best of your ability, you didn't communicate effectively. You'd be surprised at the number of candidates who do kind of enter into spaces like the Hop to the Future event or other kinds of more formal interview settings, who very clearly really haven't done their homework, both fully understanding the organization to which they're applying, having done some back-end research on members of the team, whose answers are short, perfunctory, lack detail, don't really elaborate. There's a great number of candidates who do this. And so by you simply doing your research, that's already going to distinguish you from a number of applicants and also interviewees for particular roles. So sometimes interviews don't go well for reasons that are kind of within our control as candidates. And as Roshni was saying earlier, when she talked about maybe interviewers who don't really show up in the space fully prepared themselves, that happens sometimes too, and it can kind of throw you off as an interviewee. But sometimes they don't go so well for reasons that are beyond our control as candidates. And so I think it's important when we think about factors that are beyond our control, not to spend too much time thinking about this, because it's not really a super productive use of time. But I think it's sometimes helpful for you simply to be aware that there are factors beyond your control. So I know as graduate students and postdocs, there's a population who can be very hard on themselves. And so just kind of be aware that there are a multiplicity of reasons why you may not in fact move forward in an interview process. So for example, a number of organizations might actually begin the interview process and speak to a crop of candidates who they feel would be quite compelling for the role that they have on offer. And then it's actually not that uncommon for that employer to speak with a series of initial candidates and decide that they're going to freeze the available position. Oftentimes this has to do with budgetary concerns, or to reframe it, so to actually change the title, change the salary range. And they'll do this after interviews have begun. And they might even do this after they start speaking with candidates, sometimes because they find that those candidates are actually maybe too qualified for what they feel matches kind of the needs of the role, and also what they can offer from a budgetary perspective. Oftentimes it really is materially related to budget. So just be aware that this may happen. You might also find that you put your best foot forward, you do your research, and in the course of a conversation with the hiring manager or other members of the team, that dialogue organically reveals what's in fact a misalignment between what it is that you're looking for in a role. As Roshni was saying earlier, she was interviewing for a postdoc position and actually found that she wasn't that interested in the role. And so there are kind of multiple instances where you might walk away from an interview situation feeling like it's not right for you, and the employer might feel similarly. And there's nothing problematic about that happening. I personally find that any interview opportunity that you have, whether it's kind of brief chats vis-a-vis the Hop to the Future event, or whether it's more formal interview opportunities, take those opportunities. You learn so much about the field, about roles within it, about how to interview well, but be aware that it's not time wasted. It doesn't represent failure, if you will, if you come away from that role not feeling that it's quite right for you, or if you simply don't move forward. Finally, I also wanted to know that it's really not uncommon for organizations to hire internal candidates as well. A lot of times hiring managers want to hire candidates who they trust. They're familiar with their work ethic, they're familiar with their skills. And so there's kind of a bias toward interviewing people that you know, or who you're kind of connected with through other contacts. This isn't always the case. External candidates can certainly be brought into an organization. I was an external candidate when applying to Hopkins. But it does speak for the importance of interning, of networking, of building up as many relevant professional relationships as you can in your field. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, a little bit more on communicating effectively, just as something to kind of keep in mind. Your interview will not take place simply between the specific dialogues that emerge between you and the hiring manager, you and the team. You want to communicate effectively through all of the opportunities that you'll have to engage with people that are part of the organization. This might be someone who's handling logistics, who's scheduling interviews. And when you're engaging with this person, you might kind of assume that they won't actually be part of the work that you're doing in a meaningful way. That is not relevant and should never be relevant to how you treat this person. We always want to lead with respect and collegiality to all staff at all levels across an organizational strata. So make sure when you're engaging to be polite and to put your best foot forward to everybody that you're speaking with. And I'll say that oftentimes those staff members, again, where you might not be able to put all the pieces together and know how much of a stake they have in the hire, they might have a very explicit stake and are asked to provide their feedback, haven't engaged in the way that they have, or they might also have some informal clout. So again, I don't think that you should respect other people because it's good for you professionally. But having said that, certainly it is a bonus, right? A lot of times organizations are looking to see if they're going to bring in a good colleague as well as a qualified professional. Okay, very briefly, I won't elaborate on this too much because Roshni covered it earlier, but just keep in mind that it's so important when you're interviewing to do your best to know your interviewers. So just to kind of reiterate the importance of doing your back-end research, research into the hiring manager, to members of the team if you have a chance to meet with other colleagues. There's a lot of insights that you can kind of gain from the research that you do. I recommend going on everybody's LinkedIn profile, checking that out, looking up information you can find about them on the company or organization websites. One of the things that you'll find is that colleagues will often be quite explicit about their values, how the work that they're doing represents the values of an organization. So it'll help you kind of assess whether or not you feel that this will be a good place for you culturally. Also take some time on LinkedIn to see how long the team has actually been at the organization. It's not uncommon for folks to be there maybe just for a couple of years as they're building their careers. But I think it would also be helpful if you can see that maybe there are some colleagues who've been there longer, just a way of kind of assessing turnover, things like that. The information that you get from this search will inevitably be limited. You shouldn't read too much into it. But again, you're kind of feeling out whether this team and this culture is right for you. So just something to think about. In addition, as you're researching members of your prospective team, you'll receive information that you can take in around who the key players are, who are kind of the decision makers and power brokers in the organization, if you will, what would be your relationship to individuals at multiple levels. I also think it's just fine for you to ask about the role that you're potentially being hired into, kind of ask, why is this position open? For how long has it been open? Just to get a sense of the history of the role so that you can make an informed decision before you enter into that space as a colleague. And then it's also helpful to look at kind of newsworthy projects, initiatives, anything that they're really proud of and have been celebrating. Gives you kind of a good sense into the vision of that company and also some of the values that they celebrate and that they're working on vis-a-vis the projects that they're moving forward. Okay, so just very briefly to pause here around some of the research that I did into Hopkins, I just wanted to say that when I was speaking with Roshni, particularly in the early stages of the interview process, one of the things that I did was kind of check out some of her social media, if I can admit that now, some of the social media profiles that were available on PHutures. And I saw that as a leader, she really valued advocating for an inclusive graduate school experience. She also explicitly states that she led with empathy, and that's something that's very important to my own leadership style, not something that I find is particularly common in higher ed or across multiple industries. So that really initially kind of piqued my curiosity and encouraged me to kind of lean into this potential opportunity more. And here, just by way of comparison, I have my own kind of LinkedIn about comments here, where I sort of describe myself as wanting to create more equitable conditions around grad ed, support graduate students, help them leverage their degrees toward diverse professional outcomes. So I was seeing a really kind of rare match in terms of values, just to kind of give you a sense of how I went about that. Okay. So when thinking about preparing your answers, practicing your answers, remember to do that critical reflection that Roshni was emphasizing earlier around your graduate school career, the career that you've built around other opportunities up to this point. And remember to kind of consider their value and their specific connection to the role at hand. You always want to craft your answers by working backwards from the needs of the position. And remember also that it helps to practice and to maybe do a little bit of rehearsing, to ask a friend to provide you with some feedback. I will say that it is possible to over rehearse. And so what you don't want to do is to provide answers that seem a little bit rigid or robotic, or that you're just kind of very clearly kind of searching through your mind for answers that might make sense to a particular question. You want your conversation to be organic, but the practicing that you do will help remarks about relevant experiences kind of be top of mind and to inform a substantive conversation with your prospective employer. So very briefly, let's discuss a question that candidates are likely to receive the early part of their interview. I know we had a student actually specifically ask about this, a question that is both, it's kind of deceptive in that it seems like it's pretty straightforward and you can take it in a number of different directions, but can also be quite challenging, right? So you get on the phone with a prospective employer, you get on Zoom, you're in person, what have you, and they lead with, "So tell me about yourself." Okay, so what do we say in this moment, right? For lots of graduate students, particularly your postdocs, those of us who have had research integrated into our careers, particularly if we're looking to maybe move into some industry spaces, it's really important in that moment to lead with bridging between your experience and what you bring to the role, to do it right out of the gate, to do it succinctly and effectively. So here I have examples listed of how somebody in a STEM field broadly conceived might go about this, and how someone in a humanities field might go about this as well, right? So the STEM person's representing themselves as an immunologist, talking about the work that they do kind of in their day-to-day life, right? They utilize flows, cytometry. And then for our individual who's pursuing a PhD in English, that person, like their first sentence bridges between their academic work and the field that they're looking to enter, right? So the person says, "I am passionate about how to communicate information to different audiences." Then they bring up their academic experience, then they bring up relevant professional experience. So right away, that employer can see that they are a professional that has the skills for the role and they're passionate about the role. And so it's not just about leaving academia or looking for a job they're not really passionate about, but they have really demonstrated their alignment with this particular role. And then the candidates go on to elaborate on their experience, and they kind of wrap up with expressing their enthusiasm for the position. And they do it in a way that really kind of emphasizes the impact that they want to make there. Okay, so super briefly, it's also really important to anticipate certain questions that your employer might ask you. You can actually kind of do a quick Google search into like the 100 most common experiences for that are kind of shared on interview settings. And it's also really important for you to come into the interview setting with questions of your own. So let me see if I can get this slide to pull up. Okay, very good. So here's just some example questions that you might ask. I'll just say very briefly that when you're asking questions, to be as specific as you can, to have your questions emerge from the research that you do into the company or the organization. Sometimes candidates will ask questions that are like a little bit vague, like what's the vision of this organization? And they don't really have a timeline. It's possible to ask questions that almost sound like buzzwords is kind of the point that I'm trying to make here. And your questions are your opportunity for you to do a little bit of interviewing for them. So don't forget, as much as you're putting yourself out there and you want to showcase your work for this employer, in the same vein, you also really want to take that time to assess them. So create questions that'll help you assess effectively. Okay. So super, super briefly, as I kind of move toward the concluding portion of my remarks here, just to build a little bit on what Roshni was saying earlier around behavioral interviews, behavioral style questions. It's really not uncommon during the interview process in almost any interview type of setting for your prospective employer to ask you specific questions that will have you draw on your past experience as a way of that employer assessing whether or not you'd be able to do the job at hand and to do the job effectively. And so I'm going to share with you a method that you can rely on in order to effectively prepare for behavioral interview questions. And this method, I should say, is called the STAR method. All right, it's right here, and I'm like not referring to what it's called. Okay, so what do we mean by the STAR method? This means breaking down a perspective question in terms of, and providing a response to it, I should say, in terms of thinking about particular situations or tasks that you've tended to in the past in terms of your own professional experience, specific actions that you took in response to the situation at hand, and also reflecting on the results that came from your actions and doing a little bit of critical reflecting around that. STAR is a super helpful acronym. I sometimes also kind of condense that acronym into the PAR method, P-A-R, problem, action, result. Actually, when I was interviewing for Hopkins, that shorter version of the acronym sort of reduced the cognitive load for me as I was putting together my kind of narratives. This is all about effective narratives around yourself and your experience. So I didn't get too caught up in sort of saying to myself, do I have the situation I'm naming? Do I have the task? Do I have the action, right? So problem, result, action, although STAR is also super helpful to you in kind of thinking about this and thinking about it in a detailed way. Okay. So briefly, we have a couple of examples here of candidates who relied on the STAR method to come up with really effective answers for interview questions. I won't get into too much detail around this because I see that we're running a little bit short on time, but in a word, we've got a question here. What is your proudest accomplishment? And we have a graduate student who planned an international cultural festival. This person was able to identify that there was a lack of kind of community life and social cohesion among international students. So what did they do in a very kind of specific way? They brainstormed with their team, they advertised, and they organized an annual cultural festival. And they were able to say the event is now in its 6th year. So they were able to reflect on that and show that there is actually a legacy that's still in place to the positive action that this person took. Okay, and so we have kind of our kind of STAR method all sort of laid out here as we're analyzing this. And then we have another one, maybe a little bit more challenging to us, right? What would you consider to be a weakness? This could be a question that makes candidates feel really vulnerable in an interview setting. But this is somebody, in this example, is worried about public speaking, right? Pretty common concern, I think, for many of us, even when we've done it a lot. And so here's someone who is able to articulate the situation at hand. They had to public speak and they found themselves really anxious, maybe not always speaking effectively. So what did they do? They took an improv class at their university. They've been practicing. And since then, this person then notes at the end, they've given more talks and they've gone well. So coming away from this approach to responding to this question, what does the employer conclude? They conclude that not only was this person able to take a growth mindset and build on their skills that they identified as a weakness, but this candidate is quite courageous as well. So you learn a lot from effective answers in a behavioral interview context. Okay, so you guys, you're all gonna rock your interviews. Just a little bit of encouragement for you here. And then briefly, I'm going to just emphasize one other piece of the interview process before wrapping up. So note as you're preparing for your behavioral interviews, that helps to prepare something called a story toolbox with multiple different stories that you can keep in mind to have top of mind. So when you're meeting with your prospective employer, you kind of have them there, almost like Roshni was saying earlier, you have kind of your quiver full of arrows that you can draw from when the moment arises. And finally, just wanted to kind of wrap up by noting that in an industry context, just like within academia, you may be asked to give a job talk. And so oftentimes your employer will ask you to give a talk around a particular project or initiative or a problem that you might have to solve within a workplace setting. This is really your opportunity to drill down deep in a very specific way in terms of the needs of the position and what you yourself bring to the role. So it's really important for you not to integrate all of the research you've done into this talk, but to build out a presentation that specifically addresses the questions at hand or the scenario at hand. When I was interviewing for Hopkins, I was asked to talk about how I might craft an initiative that would support graduate student mentoring. So in that moment, I didn't talk about all the work that I'd done across the board. I'd done that in other places, but really got into the weeds about exactly how I would approach this particular initiative. If you have questions about what the employer might like to see, it's okay to ask them to elaborate a little bit on the ask. Try to use the language of industry and the organization as you can research it. So this was a little bit from my slides as I was preparing my own talk. And I'll just note that when I was giving this talk, I was aware that there might be names of initiatives, projects, departments at Hopkins that I wasn't familiar with as an external candidate. And so I tried to lead with some intellectual humility to say, I may not exactly be getting this right. I drew from publicly available materials as a historian. I cited my sources, and sort of that way there's transparency between me and the prospective team of colleagues. So I'm not coming into the space to say I have all the answers, but rather here's what I've proposed. Let's think through this together and have a good conversation. Okay. So just wrapping up here, as Roshni stated earlier, it's totally possible for you to kind of surround your space with notes if you're interviewing in a virtual setting, but not to draw heavily from those notes, just to have them there to trigger a few thoughts as you're engaging. During the interview, drink water, pace yourself. If you get breaks in between interviews, grab a little snack, a little protein to keep your energy up. And it also helps when you're interviewing virtually to have the phone number of the hiring manager organization on hand. Might even just help you to feel a little calmer in the event that there are technical difficulties, which a lot of us are worried about when we're interviewing virtually. All right, so you're going to do really well. We're here for you at PHutures to support you. And last but not least, don't forget this part. Remember to follow up after the interview with thank you notes to all team members who interviewed you. Ideally do that within 24 hours. You can use that time to respond to questions you feel you might not have fully responded to within the context of the interview, and to reiterate your interest in the role. And this will distinguish you from candidates who don't do this. Some surprising number of candidates actually will not follow up in this way. Okay. And then finally, don't forget at the very end, following the interview, just to take some time to rest, reflect, and recharge following the experience. I often find that right after an interview event, it can be pretty common for your mind to be racing. This is also not the moment when your barometer to assess whether or not you think you've succeeded or not is working particularly effectively. So just kind of take some time to establish some distance between yourself and the experience. So with that, thank you all so much, and looking forward to continuing the conversation and to meeting you all and working with you here at Hopkins.
Thank you, Christine. We have some questions in the chat for whoever has time to stick around. Like we can answer those questions. I'll go backwards. What do you do if you do not have the contact information of everyone you talked with? So in the Hop to the Future event, you can see their information like right there. So you should be able to grab it. But traditionally, if you're not able to get the contact information of the teams that you're interviewing with, the person who set up the interviews and has been coordinating through the interviews, you can actually send a message through them and ask them if they can relay the message to the rest of the team. So you could do that. How do you stand out in a group interview? When we mention group interview, we don't mean that there are other candidates in the interview as well. We mean that it's you as a candidate, talking to multiple people of a team. So you could be talking to me, Elizabeth, and Christine, who belong to the same team, and we would be that group. So you're not typically going to interview with other candidates at the same time. That does not happen.